Hey y'all, I'm James Wright and welcome to my shop. Today we're going to be looking at the bench top. What is the optimal, the perfect, the best height for a bench top? Let's dive in. The bench really is the center of the woodworking shop. This is where most of the work gets done, especially if you're in hand tools. And even if you're in power tools, you're going to be doing a lot of work on the bench itself. So it's very important that the bench top be the correct height so that you are getting the most out of your work. The question is, what is the correct height? I'm actually doing a little research on this particular topic and I want to take a sample size of everyone. In the description down below and in the first comment I have a link to a quick questionnaire that asks you, number one, how tall are you? Number two, how tall is your bench? And that way I can get a bunch of information and see what is the actual average from the audience. That should be kind of fun to look at. With so much work being done at the bench, it's very important that it be a comfortable ergonomic height because you don't want to be bending over, you're breaking your back. You don't want to be working up here, breaking your back. You want it to be at a height that is, well, comfortable. If you go to the library and you start looking through books on bench tops, there are a lot of gurus out there who will tell you this is the correct height of the measurement should be this. And then you'll see another one that says, no, the correct height and measurement should be this. And then some say, well, you should do this with your arm and that will determine your height. And the other ones will say, you should do this with your arm and it will determine your height. And different traditions will have different heights. And then you look at different ages and different traditions and you'll have different heights. So why is there so much confusion over what height a bench should be? A lot of them will say if you stand up, you put your arm down, and then you put your palm out, that should be the height of your bench. Others say you take your bench top, you put your work on it, you set a plane on that, and then your hand should be at a slight angle down. It shouldn't be upright, but it should be at a slight angle down. That is the comfortable angle at which you should be planing. And then you talk to the Japanese and they're like, nope, that's the height of your bench. You talk to 17th century Germans and they say, no, your arm should be perfectly straight when in line with the plane. It should be way up here. You're going to find all sorts of different theories and variations over what is the height of the bench. And in all honesty, it really doesn't matter. It's just a different style. And whichever way you learn is probably the way you're going to like to do it in the future because your body has gotten used to that particular mechanic. And if your body gets used to it, you're going to work into something that is relatively comfortable for you. But comfortable, schmumfortable, what about ergonomics? And in all honesty, it really doesn't matter that much. Unless you are doing this all the time, every day, and then in that case, your body is going to very quickly tell you which one is the most ergonomic. And that's usually which one is the most comfortable. Because there are different ways of working on it and different methods of working on it are going to say that different heights are better to work at. So the actual height doesn't matter. It's kind of whatever you want. However, when choosing the height of your bench top, there are certain things to consider because there are different things that will obviously make it better. And that really comes down to the theory and tradition with which you want to work. For instance, with the plane, a lot of the English tradition is you want the plane to be down below you. They have it that your hand should be extended flat and that should be your bench top, which is actually a rather low bench top. The reason for that is you can get your weight on top of the plane. And if your weight is on top of the plane, you can push down into it. And pushing down into it actually means that you can force the iron to engage. In other words, you can work longer with a duller iron if your weight is on top of it. But if the iron is really good and sharp, you don't need any weight on top of it. It will engage and run along it. So if you have a higher bench, it's usually better for sharper irons. If you have a lower bench, it means you can work with it longer. So if you're the type of person who puts off sharpening longer and longer and longer, it may be better for you to have a lower bench because you can get on top of the plane. But if you're the type of person where you sharpen more often, you may want to have a higher bench. Because with a higher bench, now more of you is behind the plane rather than on top of it. And if you're up higher, then that means all of your force can be put into driving it forward. It takes less energy to push the plane forward on a higher bench. But it means you're going to have to sharpen it more often because you're not going to be able to get as much weight on top of it. In all honesty, that's kind of a little bit of semantics. You're still going to be able to get weight on top of a high bench. You're still going to be able to push a plane on a low bench. It's slightly better one way or the other. It's not a huge difference. It just comes down to which do you find more comfortable. The next one that then comes up is sawing at the bench. Now, I do a lot of saw work at the bench, and that's partially because I have a relatively high bench. And for me, sawing is far easier this way because my arm is in line with the saw at this height. If my bench is down lower, well, now my arm is kind of jacked at a weird angle and I'm running into the bench cutting down. And so a lower bench isn't quite as good for sawing at the bench, and that's why a lot of people who have a lower bench tend to get a saw bench. But you'll often find a lot of people with a higher bench that don't use a saw bench. Particularly Paul Sellers, he likes a higher bench. He doesn't do a lot with a saw bench. But then you have Shannon Rogers, he has a little bit lower bench for his height, and he uses the saw bench a lot. It's just two different methods of doing the same thing. I am 6'1", plus about an inch for the wooden clogs, and I actually like my bench to be about 38 inches. And that's actually rather high for an average bench. Generally for a 6 foot tall person, 38 inches is about the maximum. But some people at 6 foot like to actually take it all the way down to something around a 33, 34 inch bench. And that may be more comfortable for you if you like the lower bench. But generally you're just talking about that 4 inches or so, the difference between a high bench and a low bench. So then that brings us to the question that everyone's going to ask when they build their bench. What height should I make my bench at? And the answer is that you should build it at whatever height you find comfortable. But if you don't have a bench to find out what you like comfortable, how tall should you make your initial bench? Oh, there's the rub. So what I suggest is grab a board about 1 inch thick, grab a plane, and go wander around the house. Set it on top of your washer or dryer. See how does that feel. Make sure your daughter's doing her homework and then try it out on top of your dining room table. Try out the kitchen countertop, the bathroom countertop. Yeah, it's a different height too. There are lots of different surfaces all over the house that you can take a hand plane and a board and clamp it down to it and see if you like it. And you don't have to do a lot of woodworking there, but after a few strokes you start to realize this is really high and this is really low. And you start to get an idea of, maybe I want it around 36 inches. Once you get the idea of how tall you think you might want it to be, then make your bench 1 inch higher than that. And the reason you want to make it 1 inch higher is you can always make the bench shorter. It's really easy to cut off the bottom's legs. It's very hard to stretch the legs out or put them up on risers and you get a bench that's not quite as stable. So just make it a little bit taller than you think you would like it. Then when your bench is done, grab some lumber, maybe 2x4s, maybe 1x, put it down here and raise the floor up. And then you can do your work on top of that and find out, do you want it shorter? You may find out that maybe you just like doing it on the floor and that slightly higher feel works for you. It's relatively easy to raise the floor up and test a lower bench. It's a little bit more difficult to raise the work up and test a higher bench. It just makes it a little bit more difficult for holding on to things. Though it is very doable if you want to see, maybe I do want my bench to be a little taller, you can put other things underneath your work on the bench and try out a higher surface. But the best advice I can give you, the one key that is incredibly important, and the one thing that really worries a lot of people when they're building their first bench, is that people assume they're going to be building the bench. And it's very, very, very rare. I mean, it's incredibly rare that that first bench is your bench. No, as soon as it's done, you start thinking about other things you could do to it to make it a little bit better. You're going to build another bench. And then you're probably going to build another one after that. And you will slowly modify until you find out exactly the height you want on your bench. Though surprisingly, it's almost always the height of your first bench because that's what you learned on. That's what your body starts to get into. And so whatever you choose for your first bench is usually going to be the right height because that is the height you learned at. My general rule of thumb is what I'm telling people is take your height, cut it in half. You're going to be within 2 inches of that. So if you're 6 foot, you're probably going to want something that is somewhere between 34 and 38 inches. Don't overthink it. You're probably going to end up making other benches in the future because you're not the person you're going to be in 5 years. You're still learning just like you will be in 5 years. You're still changing and your desires and the way you work is going to change along with that. So don't make the assumption that your bench isn't going to change as you do over the years. So as with a lot of my videos, don't overthink it. This is one of those things that people can get really stressed out, and if this is stopping you from building your bench, don't. Build a little taller than you think you might need. You can always cut the legs down. And if you want to test a shorter bench, put some lumber down to work on, and you can quickly find out what you like. Have fun, experiment, be willing to rethink things and change them around, because this is life. Nothing stays the same, everything changes a bit. This is one of those topics that I kind of like, because you can get a lot of arguments about it, and there's a lot of people who say that this is the appropriate height, and honestly, it is wildly different depending upon your tradition and what you like and what you don't like, and your particular styles and who you are, and everyone's different. Everyone's bench should be a little different too. So I'd love to hear from you. Please fill out the form down below. I would love to get an aggregate of the average bench and the worker, and I will be providing all that information, so if you want to see the results of it, I will have that eventually typed out as well. So I hope you like this. It was a really fun one for me, and if you do have any other questions, thoughts, things I should have said, let me know that down in the comments down below. I'm always learning for that. I read through all the comments and answer as many questions as I can get to. So thank you for that. That does mean a lot. It helps out the channel, as well as hitting the like, share, subscribe. Those help us and get us in front of more people. Thank you for that. That does mean a lot. Also, you'll notice that there are a bunch of people scrolling over here on the side. They are the patrons on Patreon. They are the ones who are literally keeping this channel going. Without patrons on Patreon, or people who've clicked the little join button and become members on YouTube, this channel wouldn't exist. We have special perks for both, and that really helps us out. We are completely sponsored by you, the viewer, and thank you. Without you, this channel wouldn't exist. So thank you. I think that'll do it for now, and until next time, have a wonderful day. Dude, my bench, it's been hitting the brownies. It's incredibly high.